Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Fran Markowitz's Rituals as Keys to Soviet Immigrants' Jewish Identity. I love this article. I've been teaching this for years. This is older. One of the things as you're reading this, you'll probably notice more or less immediately is that the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. This article came out in the late 1980s. The research was done in the mid 1980s. And of course, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, effectively. So we are dealing with different regimes. But it's still, I think, first of all, there are arguments to be made that the plight of Jews in Russia is not as dire, but still not exactly in great straits now. So perhaps an improvement over what had happened and what was happening at this time in the in the mid 1980s, or by the mid 1980s rather. And there's more freedom of emigration from Russia, but it is still a potentially problematic moment. Nevertheless, I think this is a really great article for purposes of illustrating custom, because we can look at it simply. We could look, as we're looking at rites of passage in general, we can be looking at sort of a fairly classic understanding of finding a group broadly defined and examining one of their particular rituals, particular rites, and discussing its basic structures and illustrating, basically using a rite to illustrate rite of passage. Rather, this article allows us to sort of look at a rite of passage as something more than simply the status of one of its members, the recognition of the change of status of one of its members, but rather that it becomes a particular focus for reinvigorating and reintegrating the group. So I find it a really interesting aspect, because one of the things is that we have to sort of look at the history of 20th century Russian Jewish identity, in that over the course of the long 19th century, Jews had who had already been present in Russia, Western Russia, the Ukraine, back when it was called the Ukraine, as opposed to Ukraine in the terminology of the 21st century, were urbanizing. They had started the process of integrating into the middle classes and the intelligentsia of Russia, despite the fact that many obstacles were put up in their place in terms of quotas at the universities, for example, and the culturally understood benefit of additional education often meant that they would travel to Europe, get degrees there, and then come back to Russia and be seen as valuable members of the community. Simultaneously, in a way that was common in much of Europe and much of the United States, there was a certain self-secularization where strict religious observance was not necessarily how they defined themselves, and rather they had integrated as best as they could into the larger dominant, into the middle classes as best they could, and sort of saw themselves as part of the national identity. And then being Jewish was more sort of like an interesting cultural marker, something that they kept alive, but it wasn't sort of an exclusionary self-identification ethnic marker. But we don't always get to choose that, and in a way that was not entirely analogous to similar to what happened under National Socialism, where it did not matter how much one had thought one had integrated oneself into society, you were marked as Jewish, and therefore you either fled or had far worse things happen to you in terms of course, the Holocaust and those ramifications. And the Holocaust was not absent in Russia, and I have friends who are currently working in historically Jewish communities in Russia, and how they are reconciling with the national silence about Russia's part in the Holocaust, as not as oppressor per se, but during parts of the German invasion, during what they call the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, where Jews were forcibly taken and either executed or taken to camps and executed there. There's not sort of public markers in the same way. And then, so despite the fact that under the Soviet system, with an inherently irreligious, an inherently secular system, the fact that that religious practice was not kept up was okay. I mean, but they were nevertheless understood themselves as, this is sort of part of my interesting cultural background, and yet I am full-fledged Soviet, until such time as that became their identity. And despite the fact that they might have come from various republics under the Soviet system, they might have been Georgian, they might have been Ukrainian, they might have been Russian, they were identified as first and foremost Jewish. And so general consensus was that Jewishness was at the very least a stigmatized identity, and it was a stigmatized identity that they couldn't escape from. And so there was large moments of emigration to Israel, emigration to the United States, emigration to Canada for that matter. And Markowitz is interested in this community of Russian Jews, starting the emigration process in the 1970s, and that had settled in Brighton Beach in New York. And so you had a group that were welcomed in as rightfully understood as sort of fulfilling the standard immigrant narrative in terms of wishing to lead freer lives, wishing to lead lives as Jews, wishing to escape persecution. Nevertheless, weren't necessarily going to be, in large part, not through arrogance or not through stubbornness, but in large part because of the way that Jewishness was, or rather wasn't, practiced among Russian Jews in general, and then particularly under the Soviet system. So if they had even wanted to, it would be difficult to exercise that. They didn't have the same kind of expectations or knowledge of what constituted sort of proper Judaism. And much more importantly, that despite the fact that this was an identity marker that they wanted to inhabit, that's probably the right word, nevertheless there's this sort of stigmatization. And so that Markowitz examines this community through ritual, two rituals in particular. The bar bat mitzvah, which is the ritual at 13 for boys, 12 for girls, where fundamentally you become recognized as a person in the community, as you know, today you are a man, today you are a woman. It's associated with social puberty, but more importantly, it's when you begin to read. More importantly, on a religious basis, it's when you are eligible to read the Torah in temple. You are now participating, because you don't have a hierarchical, priesthood. You have a rabbinate, but a rabbi is basically a coach, as it were. The within temple, it is done by the adults of the community. Anyone is eligible to participate once you have reached a certain threshold of age. And so the bar mitzvah ceremony is the first time one reads in temple, and really that's it. If you go to a fairly orthodox bar mitzvah, it's just their first time, and almost it's this interesting blend of almost like it's no big thing, because today you are a man, today you're obviously eligible to do this, and yet everyone has this sort of frisson of excitement because it is someone doing it for the very first time. So, but that is something that just wasn't done, in large part because temple attendance wasn't a thing under the Soviet system, and it just wasn't a part of their day-to-day life. On the other hand, funerals were. And even though the day-to-day Judaism might not have been particularly active, upon death, there was an understanding of what one does with the body, and the idea that prayers in Hebrew need to be read over the body as it is interred. So there was something akin to Jewish funerals, and there was really nothing akin to the bar or bat mitzvah. And then they happen. So they happen in this Russian community in Brighton Beach. And the way that the bar mitzvah happens is it is often done not at temple. She gives a number of examples, and one that was done in one of the local synagogues and one that wasn't, because these restaurants that emerged to serve the Russian community, they are as much Russian restaurants as they are Jewish restaurants. And basically they serve the same function as social halls, ethnic halls might do in longer established communities. So like here in Cape Breton, we have the Ukrainian hall, we have the Cedars hall, which serves the Lebanese and Syrian community, we have the Italian hall, and so on. Not something much different from, say, legions and so on, but these community centers that you're usually associated with ethnic communities, where you can go and often adjacent to, sometimes part of, but certainly often proximate to what religious buildings that they might have, like churches and temples and so on, where the group gathers for adjacent to but secular celebrations. Restaurants were doing the same for the Russian community. So you could go and you could have food. You could have big ceremonial dinners at these restaurants. They were often not kosher, and so there's only a certain amount of rabbis who would go. But there was a whole cadre of rabbis who would be willing to perform these ceremonies. And what Markowitz is really pointing out is the role that the rabbi plays in this rite of passage, because it's still, she gives a thick description of, with names changed, but of young Leah as she has her bat mitzvah, and the rabbi who is explaining the ceremony. And the rabbi explaining the ceremony is explaining it and basically running it like an MC. It's not dissimilar from what Daniel Jello talks about when he talks about the MC at powwow, in that he knows that there's a thick audience. There's audiences who know what's happening, and they're because they're part of this community, and there's audiences who don't know what's happening. And so they are their goal, their job is to facilitate understanding for everyone, to not feel that the people who know this already are being talked down to, while simultaneously to not leaving out pertinent details for everyone, however much information you might have already, however well-versed you are or not well-versed you are, so everyone feels included and can follow along. So the rabbi is explaining the bar mitzvah, not doing it in Hebrew, doing it almost exclusively in English, English being the language of preference for this community, because demonstrating English facility with English, demonstrating coherence, demonstrating fluency, if not for the generation of the parents, then certainly for the children who are undergoing bar mitzvah, is a source of pride. So because this is as much about Judaism as it is about Americanism, and it is as much about Americanism as it is about Russian Americanism. Because the rabbi explains it, and is explaining it to the audience present to it, which largely comprise this newly formed Russian American community, where they had not undergone these rites. They had not undergone these rites themselves. They would not necessarily have been, they wouldn't have been bar bat mitzvah themselves. And so this two, maybe even three generations back, because grandparents are often involved and will come later. And so the rabbi is serving to introduce not simply this child through their status of going from child to adult through the bar mitzvah and through the reading of the Torah, but more importantly, just as importantly, reaffirming the identity of Jewishness and the freedom that Americanness brings, so that the new Russian American can now be more fully participant and rid themselves of the stigma that they might still be holding over from being unpracticed, from being historically, prior to the moments of immigration, shunned or silenced or persecuted. When one's own identity is problematic because of one's political context, let alone one's potential political actions, but even just by sheer dint of who you are, there's a certain amount of reconstruction that is required. And so the speech, the talk, the explanations that the rabbi gives are all about the story of Judaism and the role of the chosen people and sort of their special status. The fact that the community of Russian Jews survived despite the hardships that they went through, including the persecution under the Soviet system, including its proximity to the persecution under the Nazi system. So many different factors, but survival happened. And remember, it's really interesting. Whenever you think about narratives that are about trauma, whenever you think about narratives that are about the threat that was very real in the past and losses that occurred in the past, there is always that implied coda of, and yet here we are. And that doesn't solve the problems of the trauma, but it addresses the possibility of some kind of circumstance in the past. We think about that when we think about the trauma of people escaping domestic violence. We think about that in the trauma of people escaping asylum narratives and so on. So there's that sort of, there is a crack in everything where the light gets in. So that is one of the things that the rabbi is performing at this time. So when Markowitz does her field work and is talking to people afterwards, the entire group is moved in large part because it is not the same sort of justifiable, happy, affirmative pride that a population will often feel when one of its members goes through a ritual, because often as they have gone through this, as they have been witness to this ritual many times, and as they themselves might have undergone this ritual themselves, they sort of see it in the sense of continuity. So it is like now this one member, and it's focused on them again with that reaffirmation of the group, or the fact that this reaffirms the status of the group. But in this instance, it's a ritual that they had not had exposure to. And the fact that they had not had exposure to it before, and they get to see it, and they get it explained to them in a non-condescending way, and it reaffirms that their identity is not something that needs to be stigmatized. It reaffirms that their group has a sense of permanence, a sense of continuity, despite, a sense of a future, despite, a sense of a past, despite. And so it is about the collective, these witnesses who never saw this before. So the rabbi serves this purpose of explaining to them how this has happened. Funerals, on the other hand, a slightly different thing, because the sort of religious benefits of, or the religious meanings of the bar bat mitzvah might not have meant much to a secular or a secular Jew in the Soviet Union, whether they were secular by choice or by circumstance. It's like, well, we don't have these temples and so on. But in the Soviet Union, they still had Jewish graveyards, and you know, death is just one of those rites that you know, brings it all home. And so she observes two different funerals. One taking place in a funeral parlor, one taking place at the graveyard, and you know, interesting dynamics that were not 100% immediately apparent, like the way that Russian funerals tend to be very emotive, and Jewish American funerals tend not to be, in part because the idea is that much of the mourning has taken place before the interment, and at the very least, it's not like a hugging, it's not a throwing oneself on the coffin sort of situation. It is just slightly more staid. It's not cold, it just doesn't have the sort of same level that they might have experienced in a Russian funeral. And then the idea of the eulogy, and the eulogy spoken in a language that is understood, whether that be Yiddish, whether that be English, and typically not in Russian, which I think was an interesting thing to observe. And then the both the rabbi and you know, gave sort of basically a generic speech. They had learned aspects of the person's life from friends and family, but gave a sort of a standard speech of survival, you know, giving the key moments in their life, both referring to things like being Holocaust survivors, their time in the Soviet Union, then their emigration in order to provide, or the work that they did back home, and then fundamentally their emigration in order to be with their family and give their family a better life. And as they pass, they can live the afterlife, as it were, as Jews, knowing what they have done for the family, knowing that they have made the world a better place. And so, again, that is as much as all funerals are, of course, for the survivors and less for the person. They just happen to be focused on the person. But it is this sort of valediction that is directed towards the family. And even though this person is gone, even though this person might have had a confusing last couple of years, because in both instances they were elderly and had only emigrated late in life, so within the previous decade. So it is not like they really had the opportunity to forge an entire life in the United States. Nevertheless, their last moments, their last years, were for the benefit of their family, for the benefit of not simply the immediate members of their family, but that sense of continuity, doing something else. So I really like this article, this chapter from this book, because it illustrates rites of passage, but it illustrates more than anything this idea how much the rite of passage is directed towards the group. And when the group is fluent and familiar with their own customs, that is one thing. But this is a group that is not familiar, that has lost much of its own customs. And something has emerged that might not be orthodox in the literal sense, but also in the figurative sense. That might not be how someone who has lived with Judaism their entire life, they might not sort of see it as a rite, but this group grasps it, sees it, finds validation in it, finds meaning in it, and as a group becomes changed by it, undergoes some kind of transformation, which is kind of wonderful. So I blathered a little bit, but it's a really great article, and I highly recommend, if you haven't done so already, reading Fran Markowitz's Rituals as Keys to Soviet Immigrants' Jewish Identity. My name is Ian, and as ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, and bye-bye.